So in the last lesson, we looked at how we're able to add new items into our to-do list by switching our database from an array over to MongoDB. In this lesson, I want to look at the other functionality that we promise people, which is that when we click on one of these text boxes, it should be able to delete an item. At the moment, it doesn't really do that. It just crosses it out. But say if we had a really long to-do list and we had a whole bunch of stuff, then it kind of clutters the page when we just click on that, right? It doesn't really need to be there anymore after I've checked it off. I want to clear out my list. So I want to be able to delete the item when I click the checkbox next to it. And to do that, we have to remove that particular document from our items collection. Inside our list.ejs, you can see that currently we have this input called checkbox, and next to it we have the item name in a paragraph. If we wanted to send some data when that checkbox gets clicked, then we need, again, a form and a post route. So let's go ahead and create a new form. And we're going to wrap that form around our items div. Once we've grouped our input and our paragraph into this new form, the first thing that you notice when you hit save and you go back over to our to-do list is when you refresh, the styling looks a bit different, right? It looks a bit off. And the reason for this is because in our style sheet, so if you go into public CSS styles.css, you can see that we have this CSS rule which is targeting our HTML form elements. And this will apply the text align center and margin left to all of our form elements, which is not what we want. We only want it for this form and not this one. So what's the difference here? Well, this one has a class of item. So it's got a class and it's also a form element. So if we wanted our CSS to be more specific, then we could say for this rule, it should only apply to all of the HTML forms, which also have the class item. Now, if we hit save and we go back to our to-do list and hit refresh, then you can see that our previous styles are restored. So now that we've fixed the CSS and styling, the next thing to address is where is this form going to post to? Well, in order to specify that, we need an action and a method, right? So if we just go ahead and copy those into this form element, then the part that we're going to keep the same is this form is also going to make a post request. But the route is now going to be separate from what we had down here. This route was responsible for adding new items, so this route has to be responsible for deleting checked items. Let's add a route called /delete and hit save. Now inside our app.js, just below our other post route, we can add this new route. So we can say app.post, and the route was called /delete. And this also is going to have a callback, rec and res. And now I'm going to console log simply the request.body. So what is being sent over basically from our form inside list.ejs? Because we know that over here in our app.post, we're getting the new item being sent over. Because in that form, we have an input with type text and it has the name of new item. And we're going to send over whatever it is that the user typed in here over to this route via the request.body. If we run our app now, let's see what our console logs for the request.body of our /delete route. I'm going to refresh my to-do list and I'm just going to check one of these boxes. And if we have a look inside our console, then you can see that absolutely nothing happens here. And the reason is because inside our list.ejs, if you remember, we actually have this button here and its type is submit. And whenever we have a submit button anywhere inside a form, then its job is that when it gets pressed, it will submit all of the data inside the form and make the post request to the required route. Now, in this form, however, we don't have any way of submitting, and it'll look kind of ugly if we added a submit button next to the checkbox, right? I mean, ideally what we want is whenever we tick a checkbox, we just want it to be able to delete that item. The action has to happen when we check the checkbox. So how can we get the form to submit when the checkbox is checked? Well, if we didn't have any better ideas, then we can always ask a developer's best friend, right? It's Google. So if we put in the query, submit form when checkbox is checked, for example, that seems pretty much like what we want. And if we click on the first Stack Overflow answer, then the person is asking, how do you submit a form when a checkbox is checked? Sounds like what we want too. So if you scroll down, the first answer tells us that in plain JavaScript, simply add this attribute onChange to the input that is going to change. And then inside it, just add a little snippet of JavaScript code to submit the current form. Let's go ahead and copy this over to our input. The input that we want to trigger the submit is, of course, our checkbox. In addition to having a type, it's now also going to have a onChange attribute. And so that means when the checkbox is changed, so from checked to unchecked, unchecked to checked, then we're going to run this line of JavaScript code, which will take the current form that the input is inside, so this one, and it's going to submit it to make that post request to our delete route. In addition to just getting the form to submit, we also need a way of accessing this input. To do that, we have to give it a name. For our text input, to add new items, we gave it a name of new item, which is what allowed us to tap into it inside the request.body. So for this checkbox, we're also going to give it a name, and I'm going to give it something really simple. I'm just going to call it checkbox. So now if we save our code and go back to our console and refresh our page, then I'm going to click on one of these boxes to check it. And now if I have a look inside my console, you can see that I've got the on value printed for my checkbox. And this comes from the log statement that's inside my app.js inside this route. This is what is being logged right now. And of course, I can now tap into this thing called checkbox. So if I hit save now and I refresh my page and go back to my root route, refresh my page and check one of the items, you can see I now get the value of that request.body, which is on. On is not very useful for us, right? What we want is the item name that they actually checked off. So we know that our for each loop is going to render as many checkboxes as we have items in our items collection. That means that we can also assign a value to our checkbox based on the item's ID. Inside here, I'm going to add another attribute called value, and this value is going to be equal to some EJS values. So I'm going to add that classic angle bracket percentage equal sign, and then I'm going to close it off with percent angle bracket. And inside here, I'm going to tap into that item object that we get access to, and I'm going to tap into its ID. Remember, when we pass new list items over, we're passing over an array of Mongo documents. Each of these documents, or each of these items that we're looping through, has a name as well as an ID. So if I bind that ID to the value of each of the checkboxes, then when it gets checked, I can submit this form and find out which item was actually checked off. So now let's hit save. And let's again refresh our homepage and check off one of the items. And now you can see I've got the ID of that item. So once I've got the ID, then everything else is so much easier because we can now delete the item with that particular ID. Inside our app.js, instead of console logging this, I'm going to bind it to a constant, and it's going to be called the checked item ID, and it's just going to equal request.body.checkbox. And now, as a challenge, I want you to remove the item from the database that has the ID of the one that was checked off. Again, as a reminder, in the Mongoose documentation, you can find a method called find by ID and remove, which seems pretty much like what we need to do. So in this case, we simply provide the ID as an argument, and then we have a callback to handle any errors or log success. And when this is executed, it should delete that document with that particular ID. Pause the video and try to complete the challenge. All right, so let's do that right here where we've got access to that ID. I'm going to tap into the items collection using that item model, and then I'm going to call find by ID and remove. And make sure that you don't have any typos in there. And then the ID is of course going to be the checked item ID. And then we're going to provide that callback to see if there were any errors. And if there were no errors, then in that case, we're simply going to log that we successfully deleted checked item. Now, if we check the Mongoose API documentation and you locate the find by ID and remove method, if you read through it, it'll tell you that if you don't provide the callback, it won't actually execute the delete. It's only when the callback is there does it actually execute it. Whereas if it only has an ID or options, then it'll just return the query. It'll just find that item by ID. So in order to get the and remove part, we have to provide the callback, even if you don't care to check if there were any errors or not. Let's hit save and let's go back to our route and try to delete one of these items. Again, our web interface is not updating, but if you go over to the console, it says that it successfully deleted the checked item, which means that it's probably been deleted. And if we again check our Mongo shell and we do db.items.find, then indeed that item that we just checked off here, hit this to delete an item, no longer exists in our items collection. But in order for it to reflect in our web page, then again, we have to call a redirect, right? We can say res.redirect to the home route. And now it will find all of the items that we still have in our items collection and render it on the page. So now let's go back to our home page and let's delete some of these random ones. Then you can see that they're all just getting crossed off and deleted. Pretty neat, right?